Our world is facing harsh realities: climate change, political conflict, accelerated digital revolution, and the COVID-19 crisis have taken a toll for millions of learners around the world. Globally, 771 million people, most of whom are women, still cannot read and write. An estimated 53% of 10-year-old children in low and middle-income countries are not able to read and understand a simple story. Historically, literacy learning has occurred outside of formal education spaces, within family, community, online, and in the workplace. Growth in such learning spaces has become more visible in response to the COVID-19 crisis. Embracing a variety of literacy learning spaces ensures the spaces are centric to the needs of youth and adults, giving them an opportunity for lifelong learning. In some countries, radios, TV, and SMS were used to broadcast educational programs, while in others, digital solutions were key to continue literacy learning throughout the pandemic. Even though online learning provided an opportunity to tackle these challenges, it also worsened educational inequalities, impacting the most marginalized. Worldwide, at least 31% of students couldn't be reached by digital and broadcast remote learning programs. As we slowly recover from the devastating learning loss of COVID-19, urgent action is needed to address the challenges of the right to learn. We must unleash the potential of literacy learning spaces so that they can be safe, inclusive, and resilient to leave no one behind. Efforts should be made to continue the positive trend in which literacy learning spaces expand the learning possibilities of all learners. Governments, policymakers, and stakeholders must keep up. They need to adapt to a fast-moving world and tackle global challenges to make sure these growing spaces are recognized. Together, let's transform literacy learning spaces to guarantee quality, equitable, and inclusive education for all.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Evelyn Santiago, and I'm the Executive Director of the RNEC Secretariat. On behalf of RNEC and the UNICEF Regional Office for South Asia, I am pleased to welcome all of you to today's webinar, which is actually the launch of the Formative Assessment Package for Early Childhood Education, developed by UNICEF, ROSA, and RNEC under the guidance of early learning experts from the region. We have more than 700 registrants for this webinar, which indicates the importance of early learning as a topic, in our region. We are delighted that we are launching the Formative Assessment Package today, coinciding with the celebration of the International Literacy Day. We have been celebrating the International Literacy Day since 1967 to remind people about the importance of literacy as a matter of dignity and human rights, and of course, to advance the literacy agenda towards a more literate and sustainable society. As you have seen in the opening video played earlier, the theme for this year's celebration of International Literacy Day is transforming literacy learning spaces. This is in recognition of the challenges to learning brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic. We all know that school closures and disruptions, including the closures of ECD centers for almost 2 years due to the pandemic, have an impact on our young children. This would likely lead to learning losses and dropouts. This is especially true for vulnerable populations, such as those living in poverty, young children with disabilities, and those in remote settings with limited access to digital learning, amongst others. At the height of the pandemic, at least 7 million young children across the region were not able to continue pre-primary education, according to UNESCO and UNICEF. UNESCO also estimated that approximately 70% of ECCE centers across the region were closed during the pandemic, many of which may not be able to reopen, especially those funded by family and community contributions. This impact of COVID-19 pandemic on young learners only exacerbates the already existing learning crisis, not just in our region, but globally. As such, transforming literacy learning spaces, which again is the theme of this year's International Literacy Day celebration, is not only about transforming physical spaces or expanding learning modalities and approaches. To me, it is also about supporting our teachers and frontline workers so that they are able to effectively support our children, our young children especially, in addressing their learning needs. And so, in recognition of the need to address learning loss and to support learning recovery, we are launching today the Formative Assessment Package, which can be used by preschool teachers, frontline workers supporting parents and caregivers, and primary school teachers handling children entering grade 1. This resource package focuses on learning recovery and provides teaching and learning strategies that are developmentally appropriate. We hope that you will find this webinar useful and that you'll be able to use the Formative Assessment Package in your respective context. I'd like to say a special thank you to UNICEF Rosa for engaging ARNEC in the development of this important resource. Now I'd like to introduce to you our moderator for today's webinar, Dr. Joyce Aureliosa. Joyce comes from the Philippines and is a learning and development expert with 25 years of experience teaching in early childhood and at the university level. She is currently the lead advisor for learning recovery, supporting the Philippine Department of Education through an initiative funded by U.S. Agency for International Development or USAID. Joyce is also ARNEC's national representative for the Philippines. Thank you, Joyce, for moderating today's webinar.
Yes. Good day to all of you. Thank you, Evelyn, and it's an honor to be with all of you. Before we start our webinar, I'd just like to read some gentle reminders for all of us. Please note that the webinar will be recorded and resources shall be shared, will be made available on the RNEX website afterwards. Please use the question and answer feature located in your Zoom meeting control to ask questions. You can upvote a question by clicking the thumbs up. And lastly, we would like to request your feedback on the webinar. Please help us to complete the short survey using the link in the chat box that will be provided at the end of the webinar. All right, so the following are the objectives of the webinar. Number one, we all hope to understand the issue of learning loss, lag, and importance of formative assessment in the context of young children. Secondly, present an overview of the ECE Formative Assessment Package. And lastly, reflect on how to contextualize and use the package in line with national standards and learning outcomes. So today we are joined by esteemed speakers and presenters. First, we have Professor Nilmara Rao, is a Serena H.C. Young Professor in Early Childhood Development and Education, Chair Professor of Child Development and Education, and Director of the Consortium for Research on Early Childhood Development and Education, and is also Faculty of Education at the University of Hong Kong. Second, we have Dr. Sheldon Schaefer, is currently the Chair of the Board of Directors of the Asia Pacific Regional Network on Early Childhood, ARNEC. He was also formerly Chief of UNICEF's Global Education Program in New York and Director of UNESCO's Asia and Pacific Regional Bureau for Education. Our presenters today is Ms. Meeta Gupta, is an early childhood development specialist and disability inclusive education focal point at the UNICEF Regional Office of South Asia. She supports promotion of ECD and inclusive education in South Asia. Next, we have Dr. Deepu Shakya. Okay, Dr. Deepu is educational specialist in the UNICEF Nepal and national representative for Nepal at ARNEC. He's in charge of overall early childhood education and development programs supported by UNICEF in Nepal. All right. to set the context of our webinar and to set the context of our discussion on learning, recovery, and formative assessment, we will be having a discussion with two of our experts, Sir Sheldon and Nirmala. Maybe you could wave to our audience. Yes, there they are. All right. To start off, Nirmala, can you explain to us what is learning loss, learning lag, and what is the possible scenario of this after 2 years of school closure during COVID-19?
Thank you, Joyce. I'm so happy to be at this webinar. So you asked about what is learning loss. Technically, the term learning loss is used to describe declines in children's knowledge and skills. So, for example, if a young child was once able to sort items based on shape and is no longer able to do that, we would say that was a learning loss. However, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have been using the term learning loss in another way. In the context of the pandemic, we use the term learning loss to refer to the impact of school closures on children's learning. As we know, school closures at the peak of the pandemic affected 1.6 billion learners globally. And Evelyn has just provided us regional statistics about early childhood centers being closed, right? So we use the term learning loss to quantify the loss of learning. So for example, if preschools were closed for 6 months, how many months of learning did a child lose? So when we talk about learning loss, we're really referring to the impact of school closure or closure of ECCE centers on children's learning in the long term and the economic cost of learning loss for the nation. So, preschool children have experienced learning loss and also learning lags because of school closures. So early learning is holistic and children have lost the opportunity to develop and practice their motor skills, their socio-emotional skills, their cognitive and language skills. So children have learning lags because of school closure in much more than the cognitive domains. They've not been seeing their friends, they've not been playing in groups. And so if you ask a standard one or a primary one teacher, the difference between a child that has attended ECCE and a child that hasn't, they'll tell you, a child that hasn't attended ECCE does not know how to wait his or her turn, does not know how to pay attention, does not know how to stand in line. So these children lose also important self-regulation skills that children develop in the early years. I'd like to say one more thing before we go to Sheldon, and that is that learning losses are much more evident in children from poor families than children from wealthy families. And Evelyn has also mentioned that children who are vulnerable are excluded. So because of these learning losses and learning lags, simply reopening schools or preschools is not enough. The students need intensive support to recover the lost education, and preschools have to rebuild children's mental and physical health, as well as their social development, social skills, and their cognitive skills. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirmala, for giving us clarity, especially on learning loss and learning lag. Now for Sheldon. Okay. Sheldon, we'd like to be enlightened. No, what is learning recovery in your opinion, and what more should be done to support learning recovery in early childhood education or K-3 or 0 to 8? Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Joyce. The good thing is the things I'll be saying will reinforce in many ways the kinds of information that Nirmala has been given, but I think it's important to do that. First of all, the COVID-19 learning losses have actually exacerbated or increased the pre-existing learning crisis. The term learning crisis has been around even before COVID-19, in terms of the information about 10-year-olds and fourth graders not being able to read grade 1 texts and many other kinds of measures. So this learning crisis existed, and then the COVID-19 learning losses have come and have made the crisis in many ways even more challenging. So that the good thing is that strategies that we are finding out now in terms of recovering learning losses can also be used in the longer term in tackling the more complex learning crisis. There's also, as Nirmala said, not only a learning loss, there's a development loss. And we talked in the creation of this package about how it's important to look at both issues, whether it be physical development, health and nutrition, language development. A child who was perhaps in a mother tongue preschool program, in some structured program, is no longer there, is in a home environment, or a child who might have been in a national language preschool has lost that ability to continue in that. And as Nirmala said, social emotional development losses as well, and mental health from the toxic stress and from the isolation that children find. All of this increases learning loss and also therefore complicates learning recovery. So we have to look at learning recovery in a larger context. The impact of poverty on learning, the impact of malnutrition on learning, the impact of toxic stress in the home on learning. All of this again complicates learning recovery. So I think that two things are important in terms of learning recovery and how to support it. It should focus on facilitating this transition from the preschool to grade 1. So assessments and recovery strategies from the preschool, whatever was done, and the package will help us to do it, must somehow be transmitted to and discussed with grade 1 teachers. We know in many countries of the world, the preschool system is managed by often a different ministry from the grade 1, from the formal education system, or a different part of the Ministry of Education, and they often don't talk to each other. A preschool on next door to a grade 1, often they don't talk, let alone share information about children. So it's especially important in terms of learning recovery that any kind of assessments and experience and strategies from the preschool about handling learning recovery and learning loss must be transmitted to and discussed with the receiving grade 1 teachers. And this requires training of teachers, the preschool teachers, to prepare children of many backgrounds for what they will find in primary school, but also training of the primary school teachers who are going to receive probably a much more heterogeneous class, many more than there might have been in the past with minimal early childhood programming or none at all. How do you face this much more heterogeneous class than they faced in the past, pre-pandemic? And we also have to make sure that learning recovery focuses on responding, as Nirmala said, to the most vulnerable children. Those most disadvantaged before the pandemic will likely be more disadvantaged after. And they will need to be prioritized in formative assessments and the strategies that result from these assessments. And again, we need, therefore, teacher training. I think we come back to this later, to identify the losses, especially among the vulnerable children, and to prepare the necessary mitigating strategies. Thank you, Joyce.
Yes, thank you, Sheldon, for shedding light on learning recovery. I think talking about development loss, not just learning loss, is very important. It's a heightened awareness for all of us. Given what Sheldon explained, maybe both of you can also answer this question. Why is now formative assessment a key approach to better direct young children's learning recovery journey? Okay, would you like to answer, Nirmala or Sheldon?
Well, I'm meant to go first, so let me do it so that you don't have to look at my face very long.
Go ahead.
I think, formative assessments can help us understand and be more proactive about the kind and degree of learning loss which has been experienced by children and what might be done to mitigate it. So it can help us identify where a child was, if some kind of assessment was available before the pandemic, was in terms of learning and development before the pandemic, and then help to determine where a child is during the assessment in terms of learning and development after the pandemic, as recovery begins. And from this, we can see the extent and the nature of the losses, learning, development, physical, mental, social, emotional, due to the pandemic. We can see, therefore, how a child's learning and development, especially a vulnerable child, compares to peers who have perhaps gone through what would be called a more normal progression through the domains of development. The formative assessment then helps us to determine what a child needs, an individual child needs, in order to achieve targets and goals that might be set, and by when. So a formative assessment will indicate weaknesses in particular areas of learning. We'll be able to set goals or targets to improve the result in that area in 3 months or 6 months when the next assessment might be made. The assessment, therefore, is also key because we can identify the obstacles an individual child will likely face in achieving these goals, whether it be continuing malnutrition, toxic home environment, a home language different from that of the preschool. So we'll be able to see not only what has to be achieved, but what's going to make that achievement difficult and what we might be able to do to help in that regard. And finally, then, the formative assessment is meant not only to end with assessment, but to help teachers and parents to develop strategies and activities that are needed by when, with the help of whom, and using what methods, how to achieve the goals that have been set. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheldon. Nirmala, would you like to add anything to that?
Sheldon has given such a comprehensive response. The only thing I would like to add is that formative assessment is not a one-off thing. Okay, so exactly as Sheldon said, we have to see where the child is. We have to assess their strengths and weaknesses and provide them appropriate educational intervention. However, we just don't do it once. So after a couple of months, we need to go back and see, is what we're doing working, right? Is there anything else that we should be doing? Can we increase the dosage of our intervention? Should we be getting more people involved? What should we be doing? So we don't think that formative assessment should be thought of as a one-off thing. It is a process to track and support children's learning. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheldon and Nirmala. All right. So before we have our first speaker, I'd like to direct you to the next slide. Can we have that, please? Right there. So can you join us, dear audience? Here you see before you is the link, no? Slido link. And can you join us? We have a few questions there that that you can answer, and we'll give light also to the to those questions later on. All right. Here, can you please join? There you go. The first one. How many estimated pre-primary age children lost ECCE access globally between 2020 and 2021 due to COVID-19? All right, let's see your answers right here. 167 million, 100%, 110 million, or it's 143 million? All right, so we have 85% answered 167, yes. So that's a correct answer, 167 million. All right, now let's go to the second question, please. How long were preschools or ECE centers closed in your country due to the pandemic? Less than 6 months, 6 months to a year, less than 6 months, 6 months to a year. More than 2 years, 50%. All right. So a good number is 1.5 years to 2 years at 42% and now 39%. All right. So that's the general answer, 1.5 years to 2 years. All right. Next question, please. In your country's context, what are 1 or 2 key priority steps taken to deal with learning loss in early childhood education or K-3? So you'll be typing in there. Parenting education is a priority, yes. Learning via online, learning support, assessment, all right. extra classes for kids for online learning, alternative learning, remedial assessment, home learning partnership, reading and literacy. Oh, this is fast. Safe reopening of school, home-based learning, resumption of classes, providing working sheets or revision of the ECE curriculum, increase the school year period, longer school year, I believe, remedial classes, e-learning of products for parents, alternative learning, oh, summer reading camps as well, remedial instructions, yeah, extra class, yes. So I think we're receiving more or less the same answers already. All right. Thank you very much to our participants who joined us using the Slido link. Thank you very much. All right. Now, before going to the meat of our webinar, I'd like to introduce you to a video. A video that you're about to see actually captures the ideas of teachers in Nepal about learning loss. Now, let's see what they have to say through this video.
नमस्ते
मेरो नाम ताराकुमारी म सिङ्गल नगरपालिका वार्ड नम्बर 3 अनि मेरो बालविकास श्री देउराली आदर्श बालविकास केन्द्र हो शिक्षिका हुँ अनि अहिले बच्चाहरू चाहिँ मेरो स्कुलमा चाहिँ अहिले 17 जना भर्ना भएको छन् अनि
आज बच्चा कतिजना आउनुहुन्छ अरे यहाँ कतिजना
आज बच्चा चाहिँ जम्मा 11 जना आएको छन् मेरो बच्चा 17 जना छन् अनि यो कति सधैँ आउँथे आज चाहिँ बिरामी भएको कारणले गर्दा चाहिँ
म तपाईँसँग थोरै कुरा गर्न चाहेँ हाम्रो चाहिँ अलिकति तपाईँले यत्रो वर्ष कति वर्ष भयो तपाईँको
म यहाँ चाहिँ काम गर्न थालेको 11 वर्ष
भनेपछि तपाईँसँग धेरै अनुभव छ अनि यो हाम्रो चाहिँ मैले अलिकति कुरा गर्न चाहेँ हाम्रो यो बालबालिका लगभग गत 2 वर्षको बन्दाबन्दीको कारणले विद्यालय आउन पाएन यो वर्षदेखि बल्ल नियमित रूपमा चाहिँ विद्यालय जान थालेको छ तपाईँ हामीलाई थाहा भएको कुरा हामीले झेलेको कुरा र धेरै पछि बालबालिका विद्यालय आएपछि बालबालिकाको सिकाइ तथा विकासमा के कस्तो फरक पाउनुभएको छ यो कोभिड अगाडि र कस्तो फरक पाउनुभएको छ
बन्दको कारणले बच्चाहरू विद्यालयमा आउँदाखेरि चाहिँ अब सिकाउनलाई एकदम गाह्रो भएको छ उनीहरूले घरमा बसेर मोबाइलहरू हेर्ने कारणले गर्दाखेरि स्कुलमा
मोबाइल हेर्ने
बानी पऱ्यो अनि स्कुलमा आएर चाहिँ अरूसँग घुल्ने घुम्न नमान्ने एक्लै बस्न मन पराउने उनीहरू अनि केही सामग्रीहरू पनि सिकाएर सिक्ने कुराहरू पनि उनीहरूले एक्लै बसेर किन्न चाहने साथीहरूसँग बसेर किन्न चाहने।
नमस्कार, मेरो नाम रूपा चौधरी, म श्री जनता आधारभूत विद्यालय कैलाली 1 मनाउँदै कक्षाको शिक्षक।
यो गत 2 वर्ष चाहिँ बन्दाबन्दीको कारणहरूले विद्यालयहरू त्यति खुल्न पाएन हैन, बालबालिकाहरू स्कुल आउन पाएनन् र यो वर्षदेखि अब बल्ल विद्यालयहरू नियमित रूपमा सञ्चालन भइरहेको छ नि त है। अनि यो अवस्थामा चाहिँ अहिले लामो समयको ग्यापपछि बालबालिकाहरू विद्यालय आउँदा पहिलेको तुलनामा तपाईले यस्तो उनीहरूको सिकाइ र विकासमा के त्यस्तो फरकहरू पाउनु भएको छ?
बन्दाबन्दीको कारणले अहिले विद्यालय खुल्दाखेरि सिकाइमा धेरै फरक भएको छ। उनीहरूले सिकेका कुरा सबै बिर्सिसकेका, उनीहरूको सिकाइ उपलब्धि एकदमै न्यून रहेको छ। अनि त्यो बन्दाबन्दीको अवस्थामा हामीले घरमै बसेर पनि केही सिकुन् भनेर पाठ्यपुस्तकहरू घर घरमा दिएका थियौँ, तर त्यसमा अभिभावकहरूले खासै रुचि देखाउनु भएन अनि उनीहरूको खेल्ने बानी परिसकेको छ। खेल्ने बानी परिसकेकोले उनीहरूले अब त्यस्तो खासै पढ्नमा रुचि देखाउँदैन।
All right, thank you for that video. As we've seen, the video was very informative and gave us perspective of learning loss in Nepal. Okay, at this point, I'm sure you're all excited to listen to our 2 speakers. Our first speaker is Ms. Nita Gupta again, who will introduce the Formative Assessment Package for ECE. After her presentation, we will go directly to Dr. Deepu, who will be presenting the process of contextualization key learnings from Nepal. Go ahead, Nita.
Right. Thank you, Joyce, and hello, everyone. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to introduce the ECE Formative Assessment Package to you. As Evelyn mentioned before, this was a collaborative effort between UNICEF Regional Office for South Asia and ARNEC. If we could go to the next slide, please. I think in the video that we just saw, we could clearly see some of the impacts of the COVID-19 related school closures in the context of early childhood education from what some of the teachers, what the teachers had shared. And I think it really clearly highlights the need to really ensure, as Sheldon and Nirmala talked about, that within the learning and recovery efforts that are ongoing in countries, that early childhood education is a critical part of that. And it was good to see from your responses all the different measures that you are already taking in that regard. But we know that already before the pandemic hit, that many children were missing out on a quality pre-primary education. And with the school closures, many more are likely to have missed out on their early childhood education. We heard in the video from the teachers some of the challenges in ensuring that children's education continued during that period. And particularly in the case of young children, we know that they're less able to learn on their own, and much of their learning would have depended on the capacity and time of their parents and caregivers to support their learning. So if we can go to the next slide. So this will have impacted on their learning journey. And we heard a little bit, from our speakers before about the importance of formative assessment. So really within this context that we're in now, formative assessment can help teachers to understand where children are with their learning, analyze where there may be, learning gaps against expected learning outcomes, and then to plan appropriate teaching strategies to address those learning gaps and meet children's particular learning needs. This is, of course, something that's important not only in the current context. Formative assessment is really about good teaching and learning practice. Because in any given classroom, we'll have a diversity of children who learn in different ways or learn at a different pace. But particularly now, there's an opportunity to strengthen teachers' capacity for formative assessment. As we imagine, as Sheldon also mentioned, that teachers are faced with a widely kind of varying range in terms of where children are with their learning now. So even more so than in normal circumstances. And this can help them to address children's learning where they are. So look at children and meet their learning needs, based on where they are, to overall to improve their learning moving forward. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So based on this, and you can maybe go ahead and click all the way. We, UNICEF, Rosa, and ARNEC developed a package to help guide teachers within this process of conducting formative assessment. And it's a package as it includes three parts within it. The first being guidance overall on formative assessment and also on the use of the tools within the package. And those include what you see there as number 2, a tool for use within preschools and schools by ECE teachers and primary school teachers. And then what you see there is number 3, which is another tool, assessment tool and associate teaching strategies for use with parents and caregivers at home. We'll go to the next slide, please. So as I sort of mentioned there, that when we look at who the target users are for these resources, please go back, yeah. They're preschool and ECE teachers, but also touching on what was mentioned before, also grade 1 teachers. Because, as with these school closures, as we've seen from some of your responses that have gone from anywhere from 1.5 years to 2 years, there are likely many children who've aged out of preschool who may have gone directly into grade 1. And even, again, beyond the context of the pandemic, there are often children who are coming into grade 1 with limited or no exposure to preschool education. So it's important for grade 1 teachers to get an understanding of where children are with their learning, look at where, if children need, support with building those foundational competencies that are so important that they gain in pre-primary education, on which their education moving forward will build before they launch into the grade 1 curriculum. And therefore, this is also targeted at grade 1 teachers as well. We'll move on to the next slide. And so linked to that, then if we look at the settings in which we're looking at using these tools, they can be used in preschools or ECE centers. And as I mentioned before, also in primary schools, particularly grade 1, when children enter into primary schools, but also at home. So the tool 3 that we talked about, the third piece in the package, the formative assessment tool for use with parents and caregivers, was actually developed in the context of the COVID pandemic, and also for similar situations where schools may be closed. And so that provides guidance in conducting assessment activities with parents and caregivers at home. And also provides guidance on teaching and learning strategies that can be used by parents and caregivers at home, that ECE teachers can guide parents to use to support the learning of their children at home. And that, of course, goes beyond contexts where schools are closed. It's important that parents and caregivers also engage in their children's learning, even while schools are open, to support and reinforce what they're learning in schools, right? We'll go to the next slide. Okay, so the formative assessment tools look at learning holistically. So they cover all the key developmental domains, as you see there on the screen, and covering key competency areas under each of the developmental domains. And this was guided by a review of early learning and development standards across the South Asia region, from countries in the region, as well as it was guided by the whole process of development of the tools was guided by an advisory committee, as was mentioned earlier, of ECE experts. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, and so in terms of the overall structure and what's included in the package, this includes suggested assessment activities based on each of those competency areas that can be conducted in the classroom or at home based on the tool that's being used. And then it provides guidance for the teacher to look at where the child is with their learning within that competency area along a continuum of learning related to that competency. And then based on where the child is with their learning, there's guidance on teaching and learning strategies that they can use with the child to help them progress with their learning to age appropriate levels. Okay, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail in the next few slides. Okay, so part 2, as I mentioned, is what we're referring to as a tool that's for use with children in ECE centers, preschools, and primary schools. And this includes a formative assessment tool and the associated teaching strategies. And this has been designed for use in classrooms, because as we know, formative assessment is conducted within classrooms as part of classroom activities. And so therefore the assessment activities within the tool have been designed in a way that they link with activities that would normally be conducted in an ECE center preschool, and to be conducted as part of whole classroom activities. And then as Nirmala had pointed to, the important point that formative assessment is not a one-off. It's not about doing one assessment, it's a continuous process. And also it's important that assessments that teachers conduct of children within the classroom are based on multiple observations of the child, as opposed to a single assessment or observation. And so, the tool has been designed so that it can be carried out over time and, with observations to be, recorded based on multiple observations of the child. Okay, go to the next slide, please. And this gives a bit of a picture of the tool itself. Based on a competency area, so for example, here, competencies classification, the tool looks at the method for conducting this. So for example, as a classroom activity, a game or a learning activity, and then looks at some of the materials that would be required for it, and focusing on the types of materials that can be found typically within an ECE center preschool or in and around that environment, and then with a suggested assessment activity for the given competency. And there on the right side of the slide, you can see the continuum of learning that's noted for the given competency. So for classification, going from being unable to sort objects based on any characteristic, for example, going up to being able to do so based on one characteristic, two characteristics, and then what we'd expect them to be able to do before going on to primary school, looking at this based on 3 characteristics. Okay, and then there's a guide with the color coding to give a reference of the age of the child for those different levels. Right, we can go to the next. Based on that continuum that we saw earlier, the teacher can then look at where the child is with their learning based on that particular competency. So for example, here, if they found that the child was unable to sort based on any characteristic, they can then go in the tool and look for the associated teaching strategies to then support the child's learning to bring them up to age appropriate levels. And so there's a variety of teaching strategies then suggested for that particular competency that you see there on the screen. Right, we go to the next. Okay, and then part 3, if you remember from the earlier slide, that's the formative assessment tool. That's for use with parents and caregivers at home. And just to stress again, this is not for use by parents and caregivers directly, but for use by the ECE or preschool teacher with parents and caregivers at home. And again, for the assessment part, this would be a tool that can be used in contexts such as what we saw where preschools are closed. And based on what's feasible during those contexts, the assessment can be carried out by the ECE teacher through home visits if those are feasible. But if those are not feasible, this can also be carried out through other online or low-tech modalities, such as over the phone, working with the parent and caregiver. And based on the context, if this is done over the phone, the assessments can be carried out over time, looking at a few competency areas at a time, working with the parent. And again, it provides associated teaching and learning activities that parents can carry out at home. In contexts where schools are open, the assessments, of course, can be carried out as per what we just saw in centers and classrooms, but then teachers can still reach out to parents in terms of advising them on different activities, learning activities they can do with their children at home to continue to support their learning at home. Right. All right, so I think I'll go through this very quickly. I think I'm coming to the end of my time. This is just to give another glimpse, within the actual tool, similar to what we saw earlier for each competency area. And in this case, it's a much more simplified tool. So while we look at 7 competency areas in the tool to be used in centers and schools, there's 10 key ones that we're looking at here with very simple assessment activities that can be carried out with parents and caregivers. So in the tool, again, there'll be a suggested assessment activity. And then if we can go to the next slide, based on the feedback from the parent in terms of what their child was able to do, the teacher then can look within the tool at some suggested teaching strategies that they can advise the parent to carry out with the child at home. Okay, and there's also guidance in the package of how to contextualize the package, because it is of course important that the package is relevant to the local context and is aligned with the national early learning and development standards in a country, or the defined expected learning outcomes of a country. And so there's guidance within the package on the process for this. And we'll be hearing a bit more on this from an actual example from Nepal, where we have worked together on contextualizing the package. So I will now hand things over to my colleague Deepu, who will talk about that experience of contextualizing the formative assessment package in Nepal. So Deepu, over to you.
Thank you, Meeta, and greetings from Nepal. It's my privilege to share the overall contextualization process of this formative assessment package. So my presentation will generally focus on just the contextualization process, and the overall, I think the video has, demonstrated
training learning.
Okay, so overall, I think the context and the situation has been kind of highlighted in the previous video. Like, we are in Nepal, so we are facing learning loss due to this COVID-led school closures. So next slide, please. So before just jumping into the formative assessment package, I just wanted to give some background on what actually we had in Nepal, before we tried on to adapting this package. So basically, in 2012, we had early learning development standards approved for age 4 preschool age children. 1 year of the preschool is there in Nepal, and we must follow early learning development standards. So this was rigorously developed from the period of 2008 to 2012, following the series of testing at the field level. It had 5 domains and 66 standards and 157 indicators, which definitely sounds like really a big document, and it sounds really challenging to teachers to implement and follow those standards. So what we did was we developed the ELTS report cards in 2018, which just focused on 20 indicators out of 66 standards we had. So really high level standards we had. So it was brought down to 20 indicators which were of high level. And these ELTS report cards were utilized for monitoring children's progress and communicating with parents on children's development. So this was later on also adapted to national training package, mandatory for all the ECD teachers, preschool teachers. And we were about to actually implement this old ELTS report cards in the field, but COVID happened and we were not able to implement it. So next slide. So actually, it was really a good opportunity. We took it as opportunity to slightly adapt this ELTS report card into the formative assessment modality, a formative assessment approach. So the key consideration for adapting this formative assessment package was, like, definitely we utilized the ELTS report cards developed in country, which were already there, still yet to be implemented in the field, but definitely it was a base, and it was kind of a similar approach as formative assessment package. So we started with reviewing of overall early learning development standard, and also review of the ELTS report cards jointly with our regional office team and ARNEC, definitely. And we had to, I think, definitely look into localization, and not just simply taking from the formative assessment package, which was developed from the at the regional context. So mostly it was we had the local experts panel to adapt this process, this package, and the national training package was also already there for the early learning development standards. So we also aligned this early learning development standard formative assessment package with this national training package. And the most important part was that we didn't do it in silos. So we have, as per the curriculum for preschools, there is a daily timetable which must be followed by all the preschool teachers. So we linked all the activities in the assessment in the daily timetable. Next slide, please. So the steps followed based on these key considerations was first, because this early learning development standards is something which is approved and the government document, we confirmed interest from the government counterpart whether they would like to actually move ahead with adapting the formative assessment package into the ELDS report cards, because the ELDS report card was actually already approved from the government side to implement in all the all over the country. So as I also explained earlier, so we just simply reviewed the early learning development standards. We reviewed the early learning development standard report cards and formative assessment together. And so that we can see the alignment. Most of it was really aligned with each other. So it was easier for us to adapt. The government, jointly with government, we identified a national expert panel so who are aware about the early learning development standards, who are practicing the classroom, who know the overall development status of the 4 years old children in the preschool. So we just identified the national expert panel accordingly. And we held 3 days workshop. 1 day was virtual with the expert panel. So after that workshop, we had this ELDS report card from the assessment package drafted by our overall regional office consultant, Meenakshi Dogra. Next slide, please. And then the first, because this formative assessment package was developed in English, then we translated it to Nepali. We again sent it back to expert panel for review whether it was according to the workshop, the development process with the workshop findings or not, whether it was changed or adapted accordingly or not. And based on the comments from the expert panel, we made some additional adaptations. We went through several rounds of language edits, thanks to rigorous review by the expert panels as well as the language editor. So there were many iterations of language edits. And finally, after the final approval meeting, the package was approved. So just to highlight some challenges during this process and the outcome we have is basically still because we started from English. There are still some language issues as this is really a translated version, and to resolve that, and because we are piloting it in 7 municipalities, we are still planning for some changes in the package we have developed. The implementation part is also challenging because of the 2 issues, mainly because of the lack of minimum enabling conditions in majority of community preschools we have, because from different studies, we see that even 50% of the community preschools doesn't fulfill the minimum enabling conditions, so seating arrangements and so on. To tackle with those issues, the piloting municipalities we are working jointly with the local governments to sensitize them on the importance of pre-primary, preschooling or early learning, and then how actually they should be investing on that. So we are seeing some kind of improvement in those minimum enabling conditions, and support from the local government is there. Similarly, teachers' motivation is also a big challenge because this is something new, the additional task to them. And also they are getting globally well-known fact that teachers' workforce, the preschool teachers' workforce, are really paid less. So in Nepal as well, the community preschool teachers get less than half of primary teachers. So their motivation is also quite low. So to deal with that as well, like we are also again working with local governments, sensitizing them of the importance of the foundation, and letting additional allowances, or getting them recognized for their effort. So my last slide is on the key learnings or achievements, kind of something which we have found for past couple of months, implementations. So we have done series of teacher trainings for this, and we are seeing a significant improvement in the practice the preschool teachers are doing. Like previously, they were not used to keep track of the overall development status of the children, but now they have really maintained the report cards well. They have the portfolios ready. They are getting overall, the activities for these strategies are there for learning improvement. So they are doing it. So it's really great to find a lot of activities being practiced in the field. Also, I just want to highlight that it's the key learning from this adaptation process is that, like, basically, if you have the early learning development standards or some standards in your country, it's really easier for you to adapt this Formative Assessment Package, and it's really helpful. And again, like if you start from the beginning in the local language, it might be slightly challenging for if maybe I think if the international consultant is involved, or if I think there you seek support from maybe our regional colleagues, definitely for their involvement as well. And to get rich inputs, we need to develop it in English. But at the same time, if I think we can develop directly from the local language, it would have been really reader and implementer friendly. But overall, I find this package really helpful for bringing change in the classroom, bringing really catching the development status of the children, and also communicating with the parents. So I think the last slide is thank you, and overall this picture of our package we have. The regional Formative Assessment Package has three, part 1, part 2, and part 3. We have just one resource book compiled, and it's for our colleagues from Nepal. You can easily download it from our government CEHR, Center for Education and Human Resource Development site. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nita and Deepu, for very informative, enlightening presentation. Now, I'm sure our audience has a lot of questions. Let's further connect with our audience through the question and answer. If you have some questions, please use the question and answer function below your screen. At this point, I'd like to call on Nirmala, Deepu, Sheldon, and Nita to answer some questions. No, there's quite a lot. But the first question would be, what could maybe forward to Sheldon, what are your recommendations for parents or teachers who have children transitioning to grade 1 with no formal experience prior to grade 1? Go ahead, Sheldon.
Well, this is a difficult question because there are already children, of course, who go into pre-COVID, who went into primary school without any kind of ECD experience. They're even more so now. It's important in terms of transition in general, even where you have a preschool or a kindergarten leading into a grade 1, that the kindergarten teachers understand the context of the grade 1 into which the children are going to go, the pedagogy to be used, the curriculum. Even more important for the grade 1 teachers to understand the curriculum and the pedagogy of the kindergarten, which is often not the case. School readiness implies not only getting the child ready for school, which is what we usually think of it, but it's also getting the school, the grade 1, ready to receive the child, who, especially in the context of COVID, will have had very different experiences. Those coming from ECD, having done online, will be quite different from those who've had none. So I think there, if children are going into grade 1 without any kind of ECD experience or limited face-to-face experience, the teachers have to be especially well sensitized about and trained to understand the individual circumstances of a very heterogeneous class of children. They have to be able to identify with this kind of assessment package or with other kind of assessment tools, what are the varying experiences, background, skills, competencies, challenges that every child coming into the grade 1 faces, and then to be trained even more to be able to develop mitigating strategies, many different kinds of strategies to meet and match the very different needs of all the children. So it's going to be a much more difficult task for a grade 1 teacher receiving a larger percentage of children who have not had any quality ECD experience, but there has to be this kind of greater training provided to make sure teachers are able to do that. One answer.
All right, thank you, Sheldon. I think there's some questions, but it can be themed into one thing, the users of the assessment package. So maybe the question would be for Mita. Can you please clarify who can use the formative assessment tools and on what circumstances?
Right. Yes. Thank you, Joyce. I think I saw some of the questions there also about parents and caregivers using the package.
Tools.
And so so actually we've designed this for use by ECE teachers or preschool teachers or grade 1 teachers, as we noted. So by teachers. So even in the context where they're being used at home, we've really tried to emphasize that it's not for use by parents and caregivers directly.
Yes.
And I know there were some questions about parents and caregivers doing this on their own. And we actually made that conscious decision also because we're thinking of, low literacy, low resource settings. It's important that it would be difficult just to, kind of hand over a tool for one. But the other part is it's also, important that it's done by a teacher who can, kind of look at what the assessment is saying, and then look at the appropriate teaching strategies. And so we also don't get into, I think we hand something like this with parents and caregivers, there's the danger also that, they're going to maybe think there's something wrong with their child is behind and so forth. And therefore, I think it's important that it's, it's teachers that use this tool, and that's how it's been designed. And that's why we sort of framed it in that way.
Yes, thank you very much for clarifying.
And
Anything
can I
else?
just,
Yes,
maybe I just wanted to touch on just building on what, Sheldon had mentioned before. And I think, there's a real opportunity to do that. As, Sheldon was mentioning that, it's not only in the current context that children are missing out on pre-primary education coming into grade 1 without that exposure. And I think the normal tendency often is that we're trying to push children from pre-primary up to where they need to be for grade 1. But I think it's really important, and this is now really, in this current context, it's really kind of highlighting it, that it's important that grade 1 actually goes down to meet children where they are when they're leaving off from pre-primary. And so it's important that, that's where we're looking at grade 1 starting, is where children are coming in. Thank you.
Thank you. Nirmala, as an early childhood expert, how would you suggest self-care for educators in handling diverse issues of children, especially now we're addressing learning loss? Self-care for the educator themselves.
Okay. I think if you mean self-care, you mean like stress management for the early child. Yeah. So clearly the situation with children with very different levels of competence and very different skills in a class is very challenging to the early childhood teacher, right? So what I think is they have to be able to cope with this diversity in teachers, in their children, in their students. But at the same time, the teachers have to make sure that they can cope and that they're not overstressed. Yeah. So what we need right now is to think of the children and the teachers. So the children need certain things. They need foundational skills. They may need some extended learning time. Remember, they have a learning lag. They've lost out, right? So what we need to perhaps do is, in addition to having the formative package, we need to have some special programs to support teachers, okay? To support teachers to be able to garner resources to help promote children's learning. For example, working with parents. So you know the children are behind. You're teaching them the foundational skills. Work with parents. You know the package can be used with parents. So that's increasing instructional time. If the young child has an older sibling in the house or in school, enlist the support. So we can enlist more support to promote learning. May not be possible in all contexts, but I am reading about the use of educational technology to support these foundational skills. I think there's no disagreement among people that children have lost out on all domains. Bringing them in a classroom, they are meeting their peers and they can develop the social skills and the self-regulation. But at the same time, they do need to develop the foundational competencies in maths, in literacy. And for those, practice is important, as we know, opportunities for learning, so they can perhaps use, harness technology and integrate technology into pedagogy. Amita has mentioned that there are concerns, and Sheldon also mentioned, we do have concerns about children having excess screen time, etc. So we need to be mindful. I think let me also just quickly address the issue that you're talking about, stress in teachers. We need to give them coping strategies. Everyone has stress, okay? The thing is to cope with it in an appropriate way, right? And one way is to enlist the support of others who can help children's learning journey. Thank you.
Can I just add one short thing? I mean, this problem is made more difficult by the fact that we don't know how many, but probably quite a large number of early childhood educators have left the profession during COVID, especially those who have been funded out of private community parent contributions. Maybe it's the best and the brightest who've left because they've been able to find work elsewhere, move out of the district or into a different job, and they don't want to come back to a low status, low paying job. So you end up with teachers who remain with a more complicated class and set of children and less support in terms of other colleagues. So trying to get, teaching assistants, people from the community, parents and caregivers to help in this process to kind of make up for the lost labor, I think in the short term is also going to be very important.
All right. Thank you very much, Sheldon and Nirmala. We have quite a number of questions. No? So here it seems the role of the early childhood development educator is, this is the question for Deepu was erased, but they were asking regarding the accountability of our educators when using the tool is very high. So what can you share with them when using this tool in the ECD centers or in the classrooms? Anybody can answer the question?
Joyce, I think I have also responded in the chat.
Yeah, that was for you. Can you expound on it so they can hear you?
Yes. So basically, I think the question is around this formative assessment is additional work, additional documentation, additional pressure for teachers who are already overwhelmed and not motivated. But I think it matters on the teacher training and also how you present that to the teachers. So basically, I think it's like the teachers are practicing their teaching and learning activities so that they can ensure learning to children. And this formative assessment tool is something which helps them to achieve their goal. So basically, I think whatever, like in case of Nepal, what we have done is like we have integrated this formative assessment into their daily timetable. So it's not kind of a additional task. They just need to follow their regular task and just be conscious of certain children on how they are performing. So that's not additional task. And we are getting similar responses from the field. We have got the training and who are implementing it in the field that is not something which is really difficult. Definitely, I think there needs to be some documentation. But if you see the package, it's quite simple. You just need to tick on what level of level is the children are in, and also the documentation is regarding collecting the materials, collecting the artworks or things which children have already been doing. So it's just having that documentation. So definitely, I think it's how you present. It might sound like additional task, but I feel like it's a really good tool to ensure their objective of ensuring learning, and also it's also a better tool to communicate with parents.
Yes. Thank you very much, Deepu. Yeah, it's the viewpoint of taking a viewpoint of it's part of the teaching and learning process. Now, Nita, there are themes in the question box regarding disabilities. Will the tool be apt for children with disabilities? Can you expound a bit? Thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, this tool can be used with all children, but we don't in this. There would be adaptations, accommodations that would be needed if you're working with different children with disabilities, which this tool does not currently have. However, at UNICEF Rosa, we have actually developed some guidance to support the learning of young children. So looking at ECE, that will be coming out soon, that looks at some of those adaptations and accommodations. So that's something that can, perhaps be used in conjunction with this tool. So that's coming out soon. We'll hope to, share it with people in the near future.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that's an important question that's coming up. And I think
yes,
really a lack of resources overall in terms of young children with disabilities in their learning. So yeah, we hope that'll be helpful.
All right. After the findings of the formative assessment, what are the roles of local government for resource allocation to ECD? Still, the resources allocation for training to ECD teachers is not started by the local government monitoring as well. So maybe we can tap on the experience of Deepu. What's the role of the local government for resource allocation for ECD and possibly using the formative assessment package?
Yes. So in Nepal, I think after the devolution of all the powers under the federalization process, the early childhood education is now under the local governments, and overall planning, monitoring, and resource, overall funding is under the local government, and they need to, fully support the full, management of these preschools. So basically, what we have been doing is to tap on that responsibility, and the funds they have generally, the municipalities have some funds, some flexible funds for funding education, particularly early learning. So we convince them to deviate their funds, allocate their funds for the early, childhood education. And as I said earlier, I think in Nepal, the biggest challenge is that many of the preschools don't have minimum enabling conditions, like there is no sitting arrangements, there is no learning areas. So what we have been doing in these, modeling palikas or modeling local governments is actually doing some planning sessions or planning workshops, and then giving them insights on what are the requirements for these preschools. And like we are seeing significant contribution. For example, like after our interventions, one palika previously they had basically nothing. So we said like we are starting from zero and it should be either 10 or 100. So we are from that perspective moving ahead, and we are seeing that the palikas, the local governments are already allocating a lot of funds for establishing the the resourceful centers, and having the learning area set up, having the sitting arrangement set up. So I think it's how you sell that, how you advocate for the importance of this early childhood education, and how you convince them on that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Deepu. Okay, Nirmala, anything else that you would want to share with us regarding the formative assessment package and the contextualization of the package to for different countries? Go ahead, Nirmala.
I
Then
think
we'll have Nita.
yeah. I think contextualization is exceptionally important. The whole ELDS are contextualized. However, I also feel that every country does not have to reinvent the wheel. You heard from Deepu just now what a challenge it was, even just doing the translation, back translation, doing everything, doing the pilot work, adjusting, tweaking everything. So what I would urge you is to use what's already developed, right? Remember, we have a common biology, right? All children, physiologically, they're the same. They have the same needs for physical, social, cognitive development. Schools, primary one, all over the world tend to focus on foundational skills in literacy and numeracy at different levels. So we can look at the commonalities, right? And we can learn from each other. I was very involved in developing the ELDS, as you know, in our region. And it was so nice that so many countries helped each other. They don't need to start right from scratch. So now we've got a package. It's adaptable. Children, especially if you look at the package as Mita presented, we're going from basic to more advanced skills. Okay, there's a developmental progression, right? So in different countries, children may be starting at different levels. We know that the curriculum in most countries for early childhood, the guidelines, whatever, they're play-based, they're holistic. There may be at different levels of difficulty, but at least they're all developmental in nature. So I think that, to me, is one of the big takeaways of this formative assessment package, because it can be used not only in Rosa, not only in Nepal, Bangladesh, but other countries around, and it can be very valuable tool, and everyone doesn't have to start from scratch.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, Nirmala. Thank you very much. All right. There's a lot of questions, Mita, again, recurring question maybe you would want to underscore using of the tool, and they keep on asking if the parents, although you've explained it, can you underscore that again? And they were asking if it can be used by volunteers. I guess it would depend on their background. Please go ahead, Mita, then we'll go about teacher training.
Okay. Yeah, just to kind of go back to that point, as I was mentioning in the development of this tool, we were, as I said, very conscious about this being, a tool, even the home-based one, as I mentioned, used by parents and used by ECE teachers and preschool teachers with parents and caregivers.
Yes.
Again, as I was noting, it's important that it's someone who's, trained and in using the tool, who's trained in supporting young children's learning, so and understanding what those assessments mean. So there's a couple of reasons in terms of the focus on ensuring that it's ECE teachers using it. One is, of course, like I was saying, a lot for use in low literacy settings. It's something that you can't just like pick up and use, and you'd have to be able to, it requires that sort of literacy level as well. But the other factor in that, as I was mentioning, is that, there's the danger that, parents, caregivers, we don't know how people would interpret the, the assessment, might think that there's something wrong with their child and so forth. So it's important that it's an ECE teacher using it, who can look at that, understand what the assessment findings are showing, but of course work very closely with parents in supporting their young children's learning. There's ways in which they can, engage parents, and it's important to do that, to engage parents in supporting their young children's learning.
All right.
But very important that,
Yes.
it's ECE teachers and those, kind of trained in its use who are using
All right.
the assessment tools. Yeah.
Mita, in what capacity or what environment did you see in your experience when the child is being assessed, the teacher is there, and when is the parent there? When should the parent's presence
Be there
Yeah.
for the assessment? So the way in which we've designed these tools, so in one context, it's in the classroom, it's part of the teacher's teaching and learning practice. And even when it's been being used there, as Stephen was also sharing for Nepal, teachers can use this also as a basis of when they meet, with parents, they can talk to parents about how their children are progressing. But in terms of the actual assessment activities, in those cases where schools are closed, for example, and teachers are unable to, kind of assess children on their own, so like what we've seen in the COVID pandemic, we designed that assessment tool so that teachers can reach out to parents and just work with them on conducting some of those assessment activities. And then based on the feedback of parents, then, guide them on activities that can carry out with their children for their learning. So in that way, they can do the assessment activities working with the parents, but more advising them on what activities they can carry out. But in most cases, other than, when, schools are closed, that would be happening in the classroom, and they would work with parents on the teaching and learning activities.
All right.
So, yeah.
Thank you. For our last question, since you talked about training, Deepu, would you like to share with us, because teachers will have to undergo training to use the assessment tools, no? Can you share with us briefly your experience in using, in teacher training in the use of the assessment tools? Thank you.
Hello, I'm audible?
Yes, go ahead, Deepu.
Yeah, sorry, I'm facing some technical issues in my laptop, so apologies. So basically, in Nepal, we have this adapted into our national teacher training program called Teacher Professional Development. So there are two trainings for teachers, TPD1, Teacher Professional Development 1, and Teacher Professional Development 2. So these Teacher Professional Development packages are approved packages by government, and it's 10 days of face-to-face module and 5 days of kind of practical, kind of action research module type of thing. So in these 10 days of module, what we have done is, like, because this is TPD2, they slightly revise their practices, and they go through the daily timetable they have, and then they get introduced with this early learning development standards. They have the knowledge of ELDS from the TPD1 as well, but in this ELDS Teacher Professional Development Program, they go thoroughly for reviewing the document of the early learning development standards, and then they actually practice these 19 test items in this formative assessment package, one by one, by practically doing it. And they also, I just wanted to highlight that we actually had really long discussion when developing this process, developing this package, that whether to have kind of a early screening, part in this or not. So we agreed in this package, we actually start in the background information of the children, whether the children has some kind of functional limitation or not. So we have this Washington Group questionnaire module embedded in this ELDS report cards, and we do almost one day of training on that as well, on whether how to do this screening, what to do, where to refer to. Unfortunately, we don't have package or the interventions for, like, actually when we find out children with functional limitation in the classroom. But what we do is, like, we have referral mechanisms to the health centers, to the different trainings. So we have that referral mechanisms for this package. So basically, for the training, it's 10 days long, and we, as I said, like, it's thoroughly designed as per the formative assessment package. And also the teachers are supposed to do some kind of research works afterwards after these trainings.
All right. Thank you, Deepu. All right. Very great discussions and sharing. Maybe some words from our chair. Sheldon, go ahead, please.
All right, just one note. I think one maybe incidental or less explicit goal of the package is to encourage greater collaboration between the preschool and the grade 1 teachers. As I mentioned earlier, in some countries there is none. Good assessments are done throughout the preschool life of a child. None of them ever get sent up to the grade 1 teacher. And so there's this lack of information and knowledge about from one level to another. Literacy, who teaches literacy? Is that the job of the preschool teacher? Emergent literacy only, or is that the job of the grade 1 teacher? I've been in focus group discussions where there are arguments between kindergarten and grade 1 teachers as to who is responsible for literacy. So getting this kind of collaboration as a result of the assessment package, I think, is very important. What you want ultimately is to have a system, which is not very common, where a teacher can be a grade 1 teacher 1 year and then go down to the kindergarten because they have the same status, the same qualifications, the same training, etc. So I think this, to the extent this package encourages collaboration between these two levels, it's also important. And ultimately also what you want is to have this package in preschool education, preschool training of kindergarten teachers or preschool teachers and of grade 1 teachers. I mean, it's important to have it in service, but how do you ultimately get it so it's a routine, regular program which is understood by all teachers, all training teachers going through the system? That's what we have to ultimately work towards. Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you, Sheldon. So, all right. Thank you to all of you, to our speakers and our guests. I know you found this webinar very informative, and it would be good to engage in reflective thinking on your own time. So in the meantime, may I please invite you to look at our slide and please fill out the evaluation form for RNEC. Again, thank you very much to all of you who joined us this afternoon.